Hello and welcome to my 2023 Pat McGrath palette ranking. You all have been so incredibly patient with me, waiting for me to get off my procrastinating butt, which it's been at least a year since everyone's been asking me to do another ranking. And honestly, the reason I have not done it is because I've just found it more difficult to rank the palettes. The more I have gotten to know them, the more I go through days when I feel like this palette is my favorite, and then the next day the other palette is my favorite, and I can't decide anymore. But there were two factors that finally gave me the motivation to, push past that point of procrastination, and those were, first of all, the beautiful Martina posted her ranking video, and I just felt really inspired and really motivated to do mine. And second of all, I'm totally going to go off topic here, so if you're only here for the ranking, you can feel free to skip to the ranking portion of the video, but I wanted to share this because maybe you will find it helpful. But I have a new tool to organize work, and I thought I would apply the tool to also organize my YouTube channel. So in the beginning of the year, or actually already around the Christmas holidays, I decided to get myself an iPad mini, mostly because I had decided that I want to go digital with my lab notebook. So I work in a lab, I'm a scientist, I actually do like wet experimental work, and I always carry a little lab notebook with me, which is essentially my dear diary kind of situation. Like, I literally write everything down that I do during the day, so that later on when I have to look up what I did during an experiment, the specific conditions that I've used, concentrations of stuff, blah blah, you know what I mean, I can always look it up. And for years and years I've been using these like paper notebooks, and I've just been like piling up and piling up. But then I thought, why not just like go digital with the whole thing? And I had already seen a couple of colleagues go digital with their lab notebooks, and I felt like maybe it was finally time for me to try it. Anyway, so now I'm using this app, and I have my little like lab notebooks here organized by month. I can export them as PDF, and then I can just download them on my computer. So basically I have everything with me at all times, and I can look it up. And the other day I finally made myself a little YouTube planner. So I felt really motivated and really inspired, and I sat down and I planned a whole of 3 videos for you. So I just wanted to share that this has given me a lot of joy, and I just feel a lot more organized now that I have this tool. Anyway, that was totally besides the point. Now you're here for the ranking. Some general information. We're going to be ranking 31 palettes today, which sounds a little bit scary, and I can tell you I went about this from 2 perspectives. First of all, when I went to count my palettes, I genuinely expected that I'm going to have something in the range of 40 palettes. I've never counted how many palettes Pat McGrath has released, and I don't own all of the palettes that she has released. I like to think that I'm a little bit picky, and I curate my collection to really only contain pieces that truly bring me joy. So I was surprised that the number is so low. But on the other hand, I went back to check how many palettes I ranked when I first did this video. So I first did my palette ranking video in the summer of 2020, so that was around 3 years ago, and at the time I had only 16 palettes. So in the 3 years that have lapsed, my collection has doubled, and I haven't even bought all the palettes that Pat has released. But anyway, so because we're going to be ranking a whole of 31 palettes, I'm going to do my absolute best not to swatch anything, because otherwise we're going to be here for 150 years, and my SD card really cannot handle as much information on it. And second of all, I have planned videos with swatching my favorite shades in every Pat palette, and also doing a top 20 of my favorite metallic shades from Pat, which is also a video inspired by Martina. By the way, if that was not clear, I'm going to link her channel and her video in the description box below that I was referring to earlier. So, but because of that, I'm going to try my best to not swatch any eyeshadows, because you are going to see swatches of my favorite shades coming very, very soon. So let's get to ranking some palettes. I'm going to do this in an ascending order, starting with the lowest ranking palette, and I think I need to give the usual disclaimer that just because something ranks lower does absolutely not mean that I don't love it and I don't cherish it. If there is a piece in my collection that I don't feel strongly for, I will usually eventually declutter it, and I have decluttered Pat McGrath palettes. So just saying. So starting off with position number 31, where we have the Eternal Eden quad. Eternal Eden was released for a Valentine's Day collection, I want to say 2 years ago. This is how Eternal Eden looks like. I actually really enjoy this quad, because to me this is such a beautiful little curation of feminine, soft, romantic colors. You can achieve some really beautiful and soft looks with this. This pink here takes on a little bit more of a warmer hue, which is why I think it flatters me a little bit more than a lot of her other pinks, which tend to be more cool toned and much more stark against my skin. This rose goldy shade is just so pretty. This purple goes on forever and ever, and this is just such a beautiful, like, mauvey, cooler to neutral sort eyeshadow. So overall, I feel like this is just the perfect Valentine's Day little quad from Pat. At number 30, we have the Star Wars Dark Galaxy 6-pan eyeshadow palette, which was part of the, I think, original Star Wars release also like 2 or 3 years ago, when she had the Decadence palette in the limited edition packaging and she released 2 6-pan palettes. I'm going to show you the other one in a bit as well. And it's very interesting because at the time when I was buying these 6-pans, I went for this one specifically because it was the more unique one. It contained more new shades. The other one contains 3 repromotes, whereas there is only one in here, is this purple, which is present in another palette that I also have. But all the other shades were new. However, in hindsight, and why this palette is ranking a little bit lower nowadays, is the fact that when I look at this color story, these really aren't my absolute favorite tones. I don't mind purples, I like golds, and I think this shade in particular here, the shade Odyssey, is a really special color because it is a very interesting duochrome. But at the same time, red eyeshadow, I already have my favorite red eyeshadow from Pat. It's in the Bronze Seduction palette. I don't need more reds from her, and I don't know why she insists on putting so many reds in her palette, because I just don't know who wears reds on the regular. If you do, more power to you, but unfortunately I wear reds only like a couple of times a year. And then this purple here has definitely not become my favorite. I don't think it's an especially flattering tone on me. This shade here is almost a spot on you for VR Pink from the Subversive palette, and honestly, between picking this and actual VR shade, I will always pick for the VR shade. With the palette positioned at number 29, we're going to be taking a little trip down memory lane. So this is the Bronze Temptation 6-pan, which was released together with 2 other 6-pans, which you're going to see in a little bit, for a holiday collection in the year 2018. I very clearly remember buying the bundle of these 3 6-pans because it was, I want to say, the week after I had given birth, and I was at the depths of my postpartum, and I had initially decided that I'm going to wait for a sale to buy these, but I was feeling so down that I thought, fuck it, I'm just going to buy them full price. And I've never looked back, I've never had any regrets about it, because I love all 3 of these 6-pans to this day. They rank a little bit lower because they're a little bit older, but let me tell you, these palettes perform the same as they did almost 5 years ago, which is a real testament to Pat McGrath's quality. Now, I have always really enjoyed this palette. It's a real, like, Christmas in a palette, with a little reddish shade here, with this teal green, which I don't know whether you can see what a huge dip it has in it. This shade is really special. It's a like a very interesting neutral shade with a little bit of a bronzy reddish base to it, but then a slight green shift on it. And the thing is, and why this palette has fallen a little bit down, I think, in the rankings, is I used to adore this dark green shade, and I still do, but I've moved away a little bit from the dark smoky eyes. I just find them a little bit too overwhelming, and just not something that I particularly enjoy wearing, you know, currently. And this red shade here, even though it is a very interesting eyeshadow, it is probably the original Pat McGrath Multichrome, because it is a very interesting shifter from, you know, this like antique goldish green to this really pretty, you know, coppery fire red pinkish overlay. But the problem with this eyeshadow is, you know, it's like trying to make fetch happen for me. I've tried to use this shade on my lid, but unfortunately, against my complexion, with my eye color, it just always looks a little bit muddy. There's just something about this eyeshadow that unfortunately doesn't work for me, and honestly it makes me sad because it is so incredibly pretty. But for the rest, I have always really enjoyed this 6-pan quite a bit. I love the 2 mattes that are in here, and overall I've always really gotten so much joy and such pretty looks out of this 6-pan. At 28, we have another 6-pan from this same collection, the Holiday 2018 collection, and this is the Metamorphosis 6-pan. Metamorphosis was the only one that I think didn't contain any matte shades. The other 2 have matte shades, this one does not. This one can almost double as a matte shade because it is sort of like that matte type of base that's infused with sparkles, but I wouldn't call it a matte shade. And the rest of these are just a beautiful array of metallic neutral shades, and I've always really enjoyed all of these eyeshadows so much. This is one of the most striking silvers you're going to see. This is gold standard, the quintessential Pat gold. You have this beautiful copper, this beautiful bronze shade. This shade here, the shade Metallurgy, is so exceptional, and I am so sad that she has never re-promoted this shade, and a lot of you will never get the chance to use it. I'm not going to swatch it now because it's coming in another video, but this is probably one of the most unique neutral eyeshadows that Pat has ever bestowed upon us, and I sincerely hope that she's going to re-promote it in a palette for other people to be able to enjoy, because I know these are long gone and unavailable, and a lot of you who have gotten into Pat McGrath a little bit later will never be able to experience Metallurgy, and that makes me sad. Okay, 27 is the final 6-pan in this collection. This is the Dark Star 6-pan, and I've always ranked this palette the highest, and I've always loved it the most because it is the most unique out of the three. It is a very interesting, you know, balancing act between cool tones and warm tones, and I've always really enjoyed that about that palette, and I think it just contains some really special textures and really special colors. In particular, I've always been more drawn to the cooler side of this palette, so this black shade, this gray, and this beautiful, very like glowy purple blue duochrome. Now to this day I think this is the only true matte gray shade that we have ever gotten from Pat, and prior to owning the dark matter pigment from the Ultra Suede Brown kit, this black was my favorite black shade from Pat because it has a little bit of like that cream to powder quality to it. It's really beautiful, it's very saturated, but there is also a little bit of like that creaminess to it that I have always just enjoyed so very much. And then this shade here, the shade Interstellar, look at that glow. 5 years later, this eyeshadow continues to be blindingly beautiful. Golds are golds, but this is a really pretty one, and I remember actually a couple of years ago Millie Bobby Brown was wearing this specific gold for an event. And of course, the copycat that I am, I immediately had to go and wear it myself. But it's a really pretty gold, right? If you ever thought that gold is gold and there is so much you can do with it, just like go and search through your Pat McGrath collection and you will see that gold is not just gold. Gold can take so many different faces. Alright, at 26 we have the other 6-pan palette from the original Star Wars release. I always call this palette the C-3PO palette, but I actually don't think it's called that. I think it is called, oh, what do you know, Galactic Gold. And this is a very interesting, you know, story, because like I said, at the time I bought the Dark Galaxy because I thought it's the more unique one of the two, even though in terms of colors, this one speaks to me so much more. I like these sorts of purples. I've always really loved Gold Standard, and what I didn't know that I was missing on is this specific shade here, the shade Galactic Gold. Not going to swatch it, it's coming later. But I got this palette eventually because one of my friends was decluttering it. She had bought the Celestial Divinity, which FYI contains both this 6-pan and the Dark Galaxy 6-pan. So if you don't have the Star Wars palettes but you own Celestial Divinity, you own both of these 6-pans. And she sent this to me because she just didn't really feel the need to have both of them, and she was not super attached to the Star Wars packaging. And by the way, part of the reason why I love these 6-pans so much is also because my inner child, who is a huge Star Wars fan, always really enjoyed the idea of having these 6-pans on display. So she sent this my way, and gosh, have I fallen head over heels with this because I just think it's such a pretty collection of colors. This one is a beautiful duochrome shade. I think it's called Electron, and if you own the Utopian Dream palette, Astral Moonflower or whatever that astral shade is called is basically this shadow, but then in like the flaky glittery version. This is the metallic version of that eyeshadow, so they also work really well together. 25 is going to be an interesting one because if you've been around my channel and you've watched my previous ranking, this is the palette that ranked the lowest last time. This is the La Vie and Rose Mini Mothership Subversive. So when Pat originally released Motherships 1 through 3, she also released these mini Motherships 1 through 3, each of them sort of like based around the color story of the original Mothership, which is why this palette comes in the corresponding outer packaging art of the Subversive palette. Now, I think this palette has really grown on me, and I think one of the reasons this palette has grown on me quite a bit over the past few years is the fact that I have discovered that this shade here, the shade Purple Rain, is the kind of purple that really works on my dark brown eyes. look what a beautiful, pigmented, vibrant, saturated purple. I've always loved the gold in this palette because it is more of like a neutral honey type gold, and the shade Pale Fire has always been one of my favorite shades from Pat McGrath because it is this soft, romantic, not super glittery, but just so pretty, peachy pinky shifter. Look how pretty this gold is though. Look how gorgeous. So these three shades are definitely the stars in here for me. I don't care much for the two mattes, I have to say. This pink, besides being the type of pink that I don't like at all, is also a pretty atrocious formula for Pat McGrath standards, and in my specific palette this purple is also not one that performs really well. 24 was a bit of a surprise for me because I honestly expected that the Bridgerton 1 palette is going to rank a little bit lower than it does, but hear me out. Pretty color story, obviously very repetitive for Pat standards. Very special that it houses some baked gelée shades. This Astral, these two shades which are actually baked into the pan and have this beautiful baked gelée satin formula to them, gorgeous, just the wrong colors. And especially these two shades are absolutely sublime. This shade which has a little bit of like that cool tonedness to it, and this beautiful purple called Duchess Divinity. Now the problem is, I love this eyeshadow, but I already have this eyeshadow in my Divine Rose 2 palette. It is called Eleganza. And this Astral shade, despite being very pretty, on the eyes doesn't look too far off Astral White from the Subliminal palette. So problem number one, I kind of already have these shades. And in fact, when this palette was released, I did a video which was called something in the lines of duping Pat McGrath with Pat McGrath. I can link it up here, where I did a look on one of my eyes using this palette, and on my other eyes I used eyeshadows from palettes from Pat that I already own, so that we can see whether anyone can tell the difference. And I'm pretty sure that it was really hard to tell the difference. And the second problem is, this palette is a bit of a one-trick pony. You're always going to get some variation of like a purpley pinky look. You can't really do much with it. So that is the reason why it's ranking a little bit lower, even though you can get some really pretty looks out of it. But like really pretty looks for me is that one look. I use this shade in my crease and outer corner, this on my lids, this in the inner corners, this as a topper, and that's pretty much the only look I ever do when I use this palette. Because as much as I like the idea of these two shades in terms of their texture, what am I going to do with a raspberry and a hot pink? I can't do much with those. With palette number 23, we're taking another trip down memory lane. This is the Ritualistic Rose Quad, which was part of the Blitz Astral Quad release for the holidays of 2019. The one and only time Mother has graced us with Blitz Astral palettes, unfortunately. I'm still waiting for the sequel. Now, this is ranking, I feel like, a little bit lower because over the years I've just like not like fallen out of love with it, but I've just realized that there's really nothing in here that's so much more special than a lot of the other things that I have from her. There's no question that the textures in here are beautiful, but really I don't really care much for this gold here. It's just not my favorite type of gold from Pat McGrath. This purpley shade is very pretty, but I feel like we have these kind of purpley shades from Pat quite a bit over and over. I really like this bronzy, like this warm bronzy shade, because it looks really beautiful against someone with brown eyes. So this is a really, really pretty shade. And obviously the star of this show is this Astral here, which has the rose gold flecks to it. Very pretty shade, undoubtedly. However, even with that, I feel like we've gotten better iterations, and for some reason this palette has just become a little bit more meh for me. I just don't use it as much as I used to, which is why it has fallen down the rankings. At 22 we have one of my newest Pat McGrath palettes. This is the Sith Seduction Quint, which was released with this past Star Wars release, so the second round of this collaboration. And let me say that by me, Pat can continue releasing these quints, the Blitz Astral Quads and Motherships ad infinitum, and I would be the absolute happiest panda on earth. The formula that is housed in these quints is phenomenal. Now, the reason this palette is ranking a little bit lower is just because I don't find the color story to offer anything really unique. These two shades, or like versions of these two shades, are present in the Midnight Sun palette. This purple here, I don't know whether you can tell, is the sort of purple that has like the dark base to it. It's loaded with sparkle. It's a little bit messy. I don't really know what to do with it. The two real stars of this show for me are absolutely the two neutral shades, and I've rambled so much about both of these. This is more like a deeper sort of like green tinge taupe, and this beautiful champagne has a bit of like a blue sparkle running through it. But despite how beautiful these two shades are, I just can't rank this palette higher because as a color story it's just not a very exciting one. There's nothing very special about it. There are no unique tones that we haven't seen from Pat before. At 21 we have the other quint that was released with this second Star Wars release, the Divine Droid quint, and I actually quite enjoy this quint. The problem with this quint is that I don't know what to do with some of the colors in here. For example, this raspberry shade, clearly a very unique eyeshadow, even one that I would dare say is pretty unique to Pat McGrath's portfolio. However, I don't know what to do with it. I've tried using it on my lids and I just don't think it looks very flattering on me. These sort of like very deep purples I very much like in theory, but in practice I almost never use them because, like I said, I've moved away a little bit from the dark smoky eyes. So that leaves us with these three eyeshadows here. And these three eyeshadows here are truly really beautiful. This bronze and this green, I think by now, if you follow my channel, your ears are probably bleeding every time I mention them, because they're some of my favorite eyeshadows in my Pat McGrath collection currently, especially this Astral Lime shade. We have not gotten a lime green like this from Pat before, and I am so happy that I have this quint and this eyeshadow because it is glorious. Alright, at 20 we have the latest mega mothership. This is the Celestial Nirvana that was released for the holidays. 20 is not a bad place to be when the actual palette leaves me a little bit lukewarm, if I'm being honest. I love the variety of the mattes that we're getting in here, and I've really grown to enjoy some of like the deeper mattes, more particularly this green here, which I love to pair with other green eyeshadows in Pat McGrath's collection. I really like all the neutrals in here. This pink is one of my favorite, if not my favorite pink that Pat has ever given us. But overall, this palette just left me underwhelmed, and I think mostly because the metallic eyeshadows in here are so flat, so one-dimensional. There is no sparkle, no duochromes, and compared to the predecessor, the Celestial Odyssey palette, this one is like a pale shadow of what Celestial Odyssey offered. So in fact, I think that 20 is a pretty good position for this palette to occupy, given that I just forget about it, to be frank with you. I don't think of it very often. I don't get the same amount of joy that I do when I pull out my Celestial Odyssey palette. I'm ranking it quite high because it's quite high, higher than a lot of these other palettes where I feel like there are more eyeshadows that I enjoy, because it is still a beautiful curation of colors and you can do quite a lot with it, and maybe I should just take the time to get to know it a little bit better and incorporate it into my routine in a way that provides me with a little bit more satisfaction from using it. But overall, this is a pretty forgettable palette for me, and a little bit of a letdown. Number 19 is the Bridgerton 2 palette, and oh my gosh, how I wish I could rank this palette higher. And if it wasn't for these two stupid shades here, which are like a thorn in my eye, I would definitely have ranked it higher, because there are some really beautiful eyeshadows in here. First and foremost, can we just talk about this beautiful mint green, which just absolutely glows when you put it on your lids or inner corners. And not only does it have this beautiful mint green, but it also contains these gorgeous baked astral shades. So to me, this is like the better version of the astral from the Ritualistic Rose Squad. So nowadays, when I think a little bit of a rose gold, I will more likely be dipping into this one than into the one from the Ritualistic Rose Squad, because the one from the Ritualistic Rose can pull quite gold, whereas this one still has a bit of like those like rosy tones to it. This shade here is essentially a dupe for Gigabyte from the Subversive palette, and for people who own the Subversive palette, probably it was quite insulting to own another, you know, Gigabyte. But I finally got a peace of mind that I can just go ham on my Gigabyte because I have a backup right here. The reason I can't rank this palette any higher than this is because I actually quite dislike the tone of this shade. This is a bit more of those classic Pat McGrath maroony based purples that I really don't like. They really don't suit me at all. And this shade is actually quite pretty. It has a little bit of like a coral tone to it, and it is again in that baked gelée formula, but an eyeshadow that I just don't use very often. So to me, these two are essentially wasted space in this palette. At 18, we have the Risque Rose Squad, which was part of Holiday 2021 when she released quads which were unfortunately not in the Blitz Astral formula. With that said, I still quite liked all of the quads that were in here, unlike the quads that were featured the holiday collection after, which I disliked with a passion. I disliked them so much I decluttered them 2 weeks after I bought them. But anyway, that's a completely different story. This is Risque Rose. Risque Rose is actually a really pretty quad, and I would have ranked it a lot higher were it not for the presence of this hot pink that I just don't know what to do with. I don't have any use for this. The two neutral shades are really pretty, and this brown is probably one of my favorite deeper matte browns in Pat collection. There's something about the undertones of that brown that really work well for me. The texture of this eyeshadow is absolutely phenomenal. It basically feels like a cream. But what makes this quad obviously really, really special is the presence of this eyeshadow here. This is the shade Lavendering, and Lavendering is like fairy dust. I don't even know how to explain Lavendering because it is such a unique and interesting shade. The base of this color is like this pewtery, silvery, I don't know how else to describe it, shade, and the overlay is this gorgeous like pink purple sparkle. This eyeshadow is magical. I originally skipped on this quad when I was purchasing the collection, and later I regretted it, and I cannot be happier that I purchased it because I would really have missed on something in my life if I didn't have Lavendering. Okay, at 17 we have the Fleur Fantasia quad, which was part of the same holiday release, and a quad that I feel like is severely misunderstood and underestimated by the community. This is the one that people complained about being, I don't know, not pigmented enough, not fun enough, not Pat McGrath enough, and honestly I feel like this is Pat McGrath at her best, because if you ever wanted to have like a pastel spring color story from Pat, this is it. This peachy shade here is one of my favorite like neutral peach shades in Pat's collection. This lavender blue shade has the most beautiful like purple blue lavender glow to it. I'm now starting to swatch shades over top of each other, so that's really not very useful, but look at that. Isn't that just absolutely ethereal? So to me this is a very underestimated palette in Pat's collection, but one that I personally really enjoy. At 16 we have another Blitz Astral quad from the 2019 holiday release. This is the quad in Iconic Illumination. And Iconic Illumination ranked really highly last time I did the ranking. It has fallen a little bit down in the ranking, but it hasn't really left my heart, and it still pulls on all the strings of my heart because this palette is such a class act. I will admit this cranberry is completely lost on me. I've tried using it, but it's another one of those trying to make fetch happen situations. What I really love this quad about, and where I think its real strength lies, is these three eyeshadows. Phenomenal formulas, beautiful colors, and this Astral is like the warmer version of Astral Solstice. If Astral Solstice is too cool toned and too silvery for you, this is the champagne gold version of that shade, and I think that's the reason I've always really loved this quad, because while I like Solstice and I love the effect that it gives on the lid, Solstice sometimes just leans a little bit too cool toned for my taste, whereas this shade here, Astral Gold Allure I think it's called, is just the perfect champagne that isn't too gold. This brown here is in the Blitz formula, also a really beautiful shade, very interesting undertone. I have quite a dent in it because I use it quite often as a deepening shade. This is a gorgeous neutral. Iconic Illumination remains such a class act for me, and another quad that I feel like was very much misunderstood and underestimated by the community, because when these Blitz Astral quads were released, this is the one that got the least amount of love, but it's always been one of my favorites. Alright, where were we? For you no time has passed, but I actually went to the city, had lunch with my friends, biked back, and now I'm trying to remember how far we were. I think the last palette we did was number 16, Iconic Illumination. This may be a bit of a controversial one because at number 15 we have our first Mothership palette. In my previous ranking I basically said that I cherish my Mothership palettes above everything else, so pretty much everything in the top, like I think 8 or something at the time, because there were only 8 palettes released, they were all Motherships except for Iconic Illumination. Anyway, what I'm trying to get at, we have Subliminal at number 15, which I'm sure is going to be very controversial because I know this is a lot of people's favorite Mothership palette. And listen, these rankings and you know these different makeup styles that we have just add to the fun. So what is your favorite palette is probably not going to be mine, and vice versa. Do not get me wrong, Subliminal is a brilliant palette. It is such a gorgeous iteration of a cool tone color story. There are such fun pops of color in here, but It's just not the kind of color story that I look at and I immediately get that like jolt of joy and the little like jitters in my stomach. There are individual shades in here that I absolutely adore, but as a whole color story, this has never truly been a Mariam color story. And I want to just give an example. There is an eyeshadow in here, this one. I think it's called Ultimate Taupe. It is a beautiful, cool toned brown transition shade. I always pit that shade up against my favorite like neutral brown transition shade from Pat McGrath, which is the shade Statuesque. And the thing is, every time I put Ultimate Taupe, I feel like it is just a little too cool toned and almost on the border of looking slightly unflattering on me. And that just has all to do with undertones and your skin coloring and what suits you. And I know for a lot of people, Ultimate Taupe is going to be the ultimate light brown matte transition shade, but for me it is not. It just looks okay against my skin tone. But something like Statuesque looks so much more flattering, possibly because there is a little bit of warmth going on in Statuesque. I always feel like it's very neutral. It's actually what I have to my crease today, but in fact I think Statuesque has a little bit of warmth to it. And you know, it's little things like this that make me not love this palette as much. Is Blitz Blue one of the most spectacular blues you have ever seen? Yes, it is. Is this gold one of the most unique golds even within Pat's collection? Absolutely. Is Astral White one of my favorite Pat toppers? Yes, it is. Now, this one here, it's very pretty, but it suffers from one major disadvantage, the same disadvantage that the really popular topper in the Moonlit Seduction suffers from, and that is the fact that this eyeshadow has that strong maroon base to it that is just not my favorite. I've just come to really dislike these maroonish pinkish type of bases. Like, see here, when I turn my hand a little bit, you can see the flash of it. Now luckily with this eyeshadow, the maroon base is very subtle and it's not as offensive as the one from Moonlit Seduction, which is why I actually quite like this shade. I think the four baked shades in this palette are really beautiful. Alright, at position number 14 we have another Mothership palette, and one that I think is going to really surprise you, especially if you've seen my previous ranking. I do not know what to tell you. I don't know what has happened to Subversive. I don't know why it has fallen down the rankings so much. It's just that in the past couple of years I haven't really been thinking of using Subversive as much as I did in the past. Now, I will add this. Subversive houses an eyeshadow that I want to write love poems to, sonnets, haikus. I just want to bathe in this eyeshadow if possible. That is this shade here, the shade Subversive. But I already showed you a very similar one, actually not a similar one, basically the same shade in the Bridgerton 2 palette. I've always loved this palette for this specific shade, and I can tell you nobody has ever made an eyeshadow that comes even close to Gigabyte in my opinion. I've always thought of this as Pat's smoky grungy palette, one of the most unique ones, and one that I've always wanted to see somewhat of like a follow-up with. You know, ever since the Divine Rose 1 train started, I've always wanted to see Pat do something like Subversive again. So I don't really have a rational explanation for you why I haven't been using Subversive, because there are some really special shades. Look how pretty these shades are. Now, I will say this, I'm a little bit tired of Pat doing the blue-purple duochromes, because there are several shades in her lineup that look very similar to each other. They all have this like blue-purple shifting effect. It's a beautiful duochrome, but I think we've seen enough of that. Another shade that I've always really loved is this warm brown shade here, but I think we're getting here at a little bit the issue that I have with this palette, or not the issue, but the reason why I haven't been using it as much as of late. I have moved away, as I said, from these like deep dark smoky eyes, and this is a dark smoky palette. So unless I'm going for that vibe, which now happens more rarely than it used to, I kind of forget about Subversive. But even at the 14th position, this remains a beautiful palette. That's what I'm getting at. 13 is going to be a little bit of a surprise, because it is a quad, and it is a quad that last time didn't do so well in my ranking. This is Nocturnal Nirvana. However, I think my relationship with Nocturnal Nirvana has changed a little bit since I sort of forgave it the presence of the gold. I have always been really bothered by the presence of this gold, because it just makes no sense to me with this color story, and I've always imagined having something like Astral White, but instead of the blue-purple duochrome, like a more greenish duochrome, which would have been the absolute perfect finishing touch to this palette. So like this shadow has always been the thorn in my eye. These two I've always really loved very intensely. This VR Emerald shade, stunning. This blue, I think you can appreciate how well loved it is, because every summer I pull it out and I just have so much fun with it. It is such a beautiful shade. It resides somewhere between a green and a blue, depending on how the light hits it. VR Emerald sort of speaks for itself. It's basically magical fairy dust. I never had a very deep connection to the purple, now even less so, because it's a very dark purple. But my relationship with this gold has changed. I don't know what to tell you. It is actually a really beautiful texture, and it is one of Pat's less yellow golds, and I have come to really appreciate it in the right context. For example, yesterday I wore it as a one and done shade together with a little bit of Rosefire Nectar over top, and I really liked it. Surrounded with browns, I actually really like this gold. So I think because my relationship with this palette changed a little bit due to the fact that I appreciate more of the shades in here and I use them quite intensely, I feel like it's only fair that it rises quite a bit in the ranking, because it is a palette that I use a lot and I have a very intense love affair with quite a few of the shades in here. At number 12 we have the last quad that was released for holidays 2020. This is the quad in Interstellar Icon. Interstellar Icon just makes me feel happy. Every time I open this eyeshadow palette, I just feel joy. And I'll be honest with you, I like all the shades in here. I think this shade is a really interesting neutral because it has those very interesting brown taupe tones, and it has a little bit of green sparkles to it, which I'm sure you're not going to be able to see right now. The shade Hypnotic, again, getting a little bit tired of those blue-purple duochromes, but isn't that still a beautiful shade? But the reason that I am so deeply attached to and emotionally connected to this quad is a shade that I can't get over the fact that nobody ever talks about this shade, and I don't understand why, because it is one of the most intensely beautiful neutrals that Pat has ever graced us with, and that is this shade here, Golden Polaris. You have to put it on your lid to see how it glows and how it shines and how it doesn't even need a topper of any sort to shine and be glorious. I don't know whether the beauty of Golden Polaris is going to come across on camera. Unfortunately, I think it's one of those eyeshadows that you have to put on your list to really appreciate. But this eyeshadow makes me feel irrational. I want to buy backups of this quad just so I never run out of Golden Polaris, because if a day comes that I wake up and I do not own Golden Polaris, I'll be pretty fucking devastated, let me tell you that. So at position number 11 we have the Divine Rose 1 palette, a mothership that I've had a very interesting relationship with, in the sense that when I first bought it, it ranked even below Subliminal as one of my least favorite palettes in my collection. Or not least favorite, but the ones that I would get the least joy out of, because once again it is a little bit more cool toned, it's filled with those rosy tones. I think this shade here, despite how beautiful it is really misplaced in this color story. A shadow like this really belongs in the Divine Rose 2 palette. However, my relationship with this palette has completely changed in the past winter due to the silliest thing, the silliest reason you can ever imagine. I've mentioned it in some of my videos that I've started purchasing clothes to match my Pat McGrath eyeshadows. So I purchased a sweater which basically has the exact same shade as this cool toned lavender purple here, and that entirely changed my relationship with this palette. Not enough for me to rank it higher, but enough for me to start appreciating it more and for it to really find a place in my collection and my daily routines. I've used this palette so much in the past winter. I've used it a lot, basically means that I've gone for that one look that I really like to do with it, which is using this shade here, the shade Lovelace, on my lids together with this in my crease, maybe a bit of guest star appearance from the dark brown, sometimes not, and then a bit of the Astro shade and this shade in my inner corners, or some sort of an iteration of that. Occasionally I will also dip into this gold because I think it's a really pretty gold. Again, very smooth formula, a bit more of a neutral gold in Pat's collection. I don't really care much for these two shades, they're a bit lost on me. This shade is also present in the Sublime palette and I've never really enjoyed it because again it has those slightly warm purple tones that I can't really say look very flattering on me. This one is quite boring, nothing really special about it. But with that said, I've still learned to really appreciate this palette, and I have used it so much more compared to Subliminal and Subversive that I feel like it deserves to rank a little bit above them. And now we're finally getting into the top 10, where with our opening at position number 10 we have the Bronze Seduction palette. Mine looks a little bit different because my outer cardboard packaging is the matte limited edition. I couldn't even buy the original packaging at the time, only the limited edition was available to me. It is beautiful, but I do feel like something is missing from the experience when you don't have the stringy things, because this one is just like plain cardboard. There are no strings, no flaps, and I know that the flaps are a little bit annoying, but they add something for me to the luxury experience. So nonetheless, really beautiful packaging. But let's focus on the contents of the palette. I've always had a very good relationship with this palette. I think some of the most beautiful Blitz Astral shades are housed in here. For example, VR Fire Opal, Astral Luna Gold. I to this day use these two shades so much. One of my classic, you know, low effort but really glam looks is putting this shade in my outer corner and crease and putting this one all over my lids. If I ever feel the urge to wear a red eyeshadow, trust me, it will be Blitz Flame, because Blitz Flame is so beautiful. It's smooth, it has a little bit of like that orangey fiery warmth to it, and yeah, it's just a really pretty palette. This bronze is very pretty. I like all the mattes in here. Even the beige champagne shade, it happens to be one of my favorites because it is one of the few like golder leaning champagnes in Pat's collection, whereas a lot of her other champagnes are either pink toned or more neutral toned. The only dot in this palette, and I feel like that's a dot for many people, is this one here, which unfortunately grows a hard pan really quickly, has very little payoff. Something went wrong with the formulation of this eyeshadow. So unfortunately it doesn't perform very well, but for me the rest of these eyeshadows are all stellar, and I've always had a really good relationship with this palette, one of my favorite summer palettes. Number 9 may come as a surprise or not, but for me number 9 is the Voyeuristic Vixen quad. I have here out to show you the limited edition Lunar New Year collection because I just find it so much more appealing with the gorgeous red lacquer packaging. But I also have the original, and if you're interested in the difference between the two, you can check out a video that I filmed when I received the quad. There is a teeny tiny difference between the taupe shades, but that's besides the point. We're ranking it now, and Voyeuristic Vixen happens to be one of my top 10 favorite eyeshadow palettes from Pat McGrath because I think it is such a beautiful curation of neutral colors with a little bit of like a sparkly twist because of the presence of this shade here, the shade Rose Fire Nectar. Now, I consider myself to be a pretty rational makeup consumer, so for me to buy a backup of something, it means that I use it a lot. And one of the biggest reasons I use this quad a lot is that I actually travel with it. I took it with me on summer holiday last year. I will probably take it again with me this year because it is very versatile. You can create really like easy neutral looks. You can go really sparkly if you go into Rose Fire Nectar. I know Rose Fire Nectar is not everyone's favorite because it is a little bit of like a flaky shade, but honestly I have never had issues with it. It's one of my favorites. I find it to be such a versatile shade because you can just use a few flecks to spice up a look, or you can use it on its own for like a really impactful duochrome, like fiery pink, copper, gold shifter. What I think is happening here is that where Iconic Illumination used to be my favorite iteration of Pat of a neutral quad, that has been substituted by Voyeuristic Vixen, because in Iconic Illumination I love 75% of the quad, whereas in Voyeuristic Vixen I kind of like the whole thing because I think it's a very cohesive color story. It works really well together and you can take it in so many different directions depending on what you want to do. Ooh, you know what I just thought of? What if we put a little bit of Rose Fire Nectar over top of the Blitz Flame shade from Bronze Seduction? I've never tried that. Oh, this looks pretty. Maybe that's a really good idea for a pet pairing. Okay, honestly, is there really a difference between Mariam and Seagulls? They both love the sea and they both love shiny things. Number 8 is what I consider to not be a palette, not simply a palette, but an actual fun fest. In number 8 I have the Celestial Odyssey, which is the Holiday 2021 Mega Mothership palette. Besides the presence of the two pink mattes, pretty much everything else about this palette is stellar and it works. Some of the most impactful, beautiful, shiny, sparkly, duochromy eyeshadows in Pat's collection are in here. You have this gorgeous green Celestial Envy, this pinky gold flip eyeshadow, Bronze Nova, which is one of the most beautiful neutrals. You have Corrupt Copper, which is such a delicious orange shade. There's really not a single eyeshadow in here that doesn't spark joy in me, and you can take this palette into so many directions. You can do really deep smoky eye, you can go neutral, you can go warm toned, you can go a little bit more cooler toned. It just offers you so much more variety and such interesting textures. despite the fact that there are really no baked shades in here. These eyeshadows are dimensional, they are interesting, they have a shine, they have something going on to them that is more than the color that you see. So I have always really loved and enjoyed Celestial Odyssey. To this day it is one of my favorite palettes to pull out for, and it just rightfully deserves to be in the top 10, to be honest. I keep saying that because I feel like I need to have an excuse or an explanation why I'm not putting only motherships in my top 10. At position number 7, we have the newest installment in the Mothership range. This is Mothership 10 Moonlit Seduction. And I have had a lot of criticism for this palette, a lot of really valid criticism, because I will never be able to overlook the fact that this palette doesn't contain a single actual baked Blitz Astral shade. And hear me out. I know these shades are really pretty despite the fact that they are not in the baked formula. However, the baked formula and the elegance of that formula, how sophisticated it is, lightweight and just elegant on the lid, that is what sets Pat's brand apart for me from all the other brands. I actually think that if these were in the baked formula, like I keep imagining these eyeshadows in the baked formula, like the Astral formula, and I think if they were in that formula, this palette might actually have ranked in my top 5 because I've truly enjoyed creating looks with it. You can take it very neutral, you can take it very like smoky cool toned. This shade Platinum Dusk here is absolute chef's kiss. You can absolutely create some really stunning and show-stopping looks with this palette. But you know, my criticism for the Astral Blitz shade remains, and my second criticism of this palette is that it is so limiting because of the mass that you're given to work with. I think this Rosewood shade is okay, I could take it or leave it, it doesn't really bother me too much. This purple though, it really bothers me. I just don't like it. I don't like it because personally against my skin it just really doesn't work. These sort of like maroony purpley shades make me look really sickly and really tired, so I don't like them. I will never get tired of showing people what the Moonlit Seduction looks like for me, because my Moonlit Seduction basically looks like this. I never use this purple shade, and I always pull out for statuesque when I'm going to use this palette because I need to, you know, balance out the rest of the shades with some sort of a matte through my crease. So for me, the perfect Moonlit Seduction palette would have been with a brown, and it doesn't have to be statuesque, it could have been something a little bit deeper to accommodate for different depths of skin, but just give me a brown. I'm tired of the purples and the pinks, please give me a brown. Number 6, we have Mothership 9 Utopian Dream, and let me tell you, I can never say the name of this palette without hearing Kara's voice in my head. I don't know if you guys watch Kara from Beauty and the Freeze. First of all, she calls Pat McGrath and Tom Ford Thomas and Patricia, and second of all, she used to call this palette Utopian Scheme. So now every time I say Utopian Dream out loud, my first instinct is to actually say Utopian Scheme, which is hilarious. Kara is hilarious. Highly recommend her channel. But Utopian Dream, we're talking about Utopian Dream. You might be surprised that this palette is ranking so high, but when I, you know, looked at the facts, I actually really like this palette. I don't quite side with the criticism that this palette is too pink. In my opinion, if anything, it's more of like a coral-based color story, and there are very few pink elements in here, and the pink elements are rather subtle. Like this dusty pink here is a beautiful matte shade, it's not offensively pink. The rest of the shades are actually completely different tones, but they're all beautiful. And I think one of the reasons maybe that Subversive has fallen down the rankings a little bit is that there are eyeshadows in here that remind me of eyeshadows in Subversive. For example, this shade reminds me of the one in Subversive, but I like it better. And it's really interesting because if you had asked me before I started this ranking if Utopian Dream is going to rank very highly, I would have probably said no, because I never really thought of Utopian Dream as one of my favorite Pat palettes, but when I sat down and thought about it, I've actually gotten to the conclusion that I truly really enjoy this palette. It is more of a summer palette for me, so I haven't used it as intensely now in the winter, but now that we're transitioning into summer, I can tell you this palette is going to be used a lot. How many of you are surprised that Utopian Dream is ranking so high? I'm curious. Now, before we get into the top 5, I want to make a disclaimer that from this point onwards, on any given day, I might change my opinion about which one my favorite is and what the order of these palettes is. I love all of them so intensely that on a different day you will ask me and I will tell you that one of them is my favorite above another. Depending on which season you ask me, I will also change my mind. I hate to say it, but in fact I do use my Pat McGrath palettes quite seasonally, and that has nothing to do with the fact that I don't want to whack on a bright orange or a bright coral during the winter. I just don't have the fitting attire for it. I've realized that I match my makeup a lot to my clothing, and because I have colorful clothing and I have different color palettes in the winter and in the summer, I just focus on different palettes during the winter versus the summer. Winter is very much reserved for Moonlit Seduction, Divine Rose 1, Subliminal, whereas in the summer, Utopian Dream, Divine Rose 2, even Sublime really take center stage. So at position number 5, we have the OG, My First Love, Mothership to Sublime. She has fallen a little bit down the rankings because I've decided to not go about this emotionally and with nostalgia this time around. Last time I ranked this palette as my queen because she was my first love from Pat McGrath Labs, and the reason that I got into Pat McGrath eyeshadows, she's not the first item that I own from the brand. I had a matte trans lipstick before I bought eyeshadows, because at the time I truly believed, who is this woman to charge this outrageous amount of money for 10 eyeshadows? I just didn't understand Pat McGrath or her brand. But once I got the Sublime palette, it all changed. I learned tricks that I had never even imagined before. I learned of the existence of textures that I had never touched before in my life. So this palette holds a very special place in my heart, and to this day I feel like this is one of the more underrated pieces in her collection because it is beautiful, it is versatile, you can do so many different types of looks with it. And what happens to be one of the biggest reasons why I love this palette is that it houses two of my absolute favorite shades, which are the green duochrome over here and this shade, the shade VR Nectar. We are going to talk about my favorite shade in every palette, so I'm not going to swatch them for you, also because due to completely selfish reasons, you can see the mesh here underneath VR Nectar. So I don't want to waste any of my VR Nectar to swatch it here for you in this video. We're going to swatch it in a different video. I don't want to rank it as one of my top 3 anymore because, rationally speaking, there are actually a couple of eyeshadows in here that I truly don't like and I never really use. The shade Astral, whatever it's called, this one here, has a pretty abysmal formula to it. Something went wrong with the making of this eyeshadow because it feels nothing like Astral White from Subliminal, which I think it is meant to be the counterpart of, but then with pink sparkles. It feels dry, it feels like sandpaper. I don't know what to do with it, I never have. This Champagne Pink, I really don't like it. I really don't like this eyeshadow. Like I mentioned, this satin, like purpley, warm purpley shade is another one that just doesn't really tickle my pickle. With that said, the feelings are still very strong. Now, position number 4 is reserved for a palette that I'm sure is going to shock and abhor you, because how dare I put Mothership for Decadence, that doesn't have a single Blitz Astral shade, in my top 5 above Sublime of all things. But you know what? I've discovered that Decadence is like a box of celebrations for me. First of all, this eyeshadow smells like cocoa powder. And I don't know whether you guys have celebrations in your country, but it's basically these little like candy boxes which contain a mix of like a mini Milky Way and a mini Mars and a mini Twix, and you pull out, and every time you pull out, you just pull out a different candy, a different flavor, but it's a joyous explosion in your mouth every single time. And this is how I feel about this palette. I don't consider this to be a very like cohesive one color story because it's just 10 jeweled metallics. There isn't a single matte shade in here. These range from very striking like molten metallics to like a satin shimmer type of situation. Like these two are more on the satin side, but there are a lot of really intensely beautiful metallic shades in here that just go on and swatch forever and ever, and they're really interesting tones. Look how stunning these are. They're just shiny, they're reflective, they're beautiful tones. I don't know what to tell you, man. Last time I did this ranking, I hadn't owned the Decadence palette, I think, for long enough to really form a relationship with it. But now that I have very strong emotional attachment to it. I feel like a lot of these eyeshadows I would feel sad if I didn't own in my collection. So Decadence has truly become one of my favorite Pat McGrath palettes, even though it doesn't contain any Astral Bliss shades. So for something like this to come out of my mouth, you can imagine how beautiful these eyeshadows are. And if you've been paying attention and you know a little bit my collection, you probably know what the top 3 is. You're probably just wondering exactly at what the order is going to be. Now at position number 3, we have my beloved Divine Rose 2 palette. And here I want to say, if you ask me in 2 months, in the depth of summer, which my favorite eyeshadow palette from Pat McGrath is, I could easily tell you that it's the Divine Rose 2 palette, because last year when I was thinking of redoing my ranking, which was again towards the summer months, I truly would have told you that my absolute favorite Pat McGrath palette right now is the Divine Rose 2 palette. There really isn't a single eyeshadow in here that I truly dislike and I don't have use for. Even this hot pink on a nice summer day with the correct clothing and a little bit of this topper makes me feel happy and at my best. This is just such a joyous palette, and to me this is like summer distilled in eyeshadow. So many absolutely stellar eyeshadows are in here. I love this bronze, this gold, this topper here. VR's Extraterrestrial remains my favorite multichrome from Pat. Eleganza is everything it promises to be. It's such an elegant, beautiful purple. The Divine Rose 2 is undoubtedly one of my most heavily used Pat McGrath palettes, and I think in terms of a color story, probably one of the most attractive to me. Like, I look at this color story and I identify myself with it. So I have really deep feelings for the Divine Rose 2 palette, as you can tell. Speaking of deep feelings, let's talk about the palette that is positioned at number 2. Which is going to be one of the holiday queens that was released for this past holiday. This is Bronze Bliss. Bronze Bliss, I don't know. I don't know whether Pat was possessed by some sort of like a genius spirit when she was creating this formula and this color story, but I adore Bronze Bliss. I cannot get enough of Bronze Bliss. These eyeshadows, they feel like molten liquids. I don't want to call them metallics because I think it is an insult to metallics to put these eyeshadows in the same category. Bronze Bliss is a stunning collection of neutrals in a stellar formula, and I think it is a really good representation of where my makeup style has been in the past year, which is interesting neutrals. Because pretty much every shade in here is an interesting neutral. Obviously we have the matte shade, which doesn't really count as an interesting neutral because it's just a matte shade. We can disregard those, but each and every one of these other 4 shades here is stunning. I don't know whether anything says it better than the shade Lunar Luxury, which really feels like the Birkin bag of eyeshadows. It is such an incredibly interesting tone of like that silvery taupe in an absolutely blinding formula. It is literally blinding you and my camera right now. I've gotten so much joy out of using this squint that I will be honest with you, once again I'm feeling very rational when it comes to this eyeshadow palette, and I'm feeling like maybe I should get or should have gotten a backup, because unfortunately these are really small in size and I don't know what I would do if I didn't have this squint. Which means that our winner, my absolute favorite Pat McGrath palette in 2023, is Midnight Sun. Who is shocked? I was truly shocked when I found out that Midnight Sun is my favorite Pat McGrath palette, because last time I ranked this palette it scored at number 6, and I never would have predicted that it would turn into one of my favorite, and actually my favorite Pat McGrath palette. But much has changed in the meantime, apparently. I have really gotten to know this palette, I've gotten to know its strengths, I have discovered its versatility, and I have particularly developed a very deep emotional connection to this purple shade here, because I bought a bunch of purple clothing in the winter. So this shade, purple shade, together with Bronze Bliss from the Lunar Luxury squint, basically never left my eyelids all throughout the winter. But the reason I have fallen in love with Midnight Sun over the past couple of years is that it can do everything. It is like a multi-trick pony. You can do neutral looks, you can do green looks, you can do purple looks, you can do fiery orangey red looks. It just gives you pretty much everything in one palette. It's such a beautifully curated color story, and it is probably one of Pat's most versatile eyeshadow palettes. As much as I love Divine Rose 2, as much as I love Utopian Dream, they are much more limited in the amount of types of looks that you can achieve, whereas Midnight Sun gives you so many possibilities. But I certainly don't want you to get the idea that I'm ranking this palette first for pragmatic reasons. Yes, there is the pragmatic aspect to it. I do think this palette is incredibly versatile, but I also really have enjoyed using it. I've just been looking forward to using my Midnight Sun palette, and in the past year or two it has turned into one of my favorites, and this past winter in particular, I feel like our love affair really reached whole new levels. I almost have the feeling that my enthusiasm for this palette isn't coming across, but you should realize that after rambling about 31 palettes, I'm pretty knackered, okay? I'm thirsty, I'm tired, I just want to get this over with. So it is a bit unfortunate for the first palette in such a ranking, but also, as I said, if you asked me tomorrow, Bronze Bliss might be my favorite or Divine Rose 2 might be my favorite. Like the top 5, anything could change at any point. I know a lot of you out there who follow my channel have followed it specifically for my Pat McGrath content, so you know a little bit about my relationship with these palettes and the brand, and I'm very curious whether you saw at all coming what was going to be in my top 5. I'm exceptionally curious what surprised you and what shocked you the most, because I'm sure that some of these were a real surprise to you, and I would love to know what your at least top 3 Pat McGrath palettes are currently in your collection. I think I will leave it at that because I've already rambled for 2 full hours and I still need to go and edit all of this. As usual, thank you so much for watching. As I mentioned, 2 more videos are coming with Pat McGrath content, so stay tuned, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!